Hello, welcome to Tea Time in Olympia. I'm Lucas Miller, and my guest today is Rosalinda Noriega, founder of Partners in Prevention Education and currently Executive Director of Pizza Klatch. Rosalinda, thank you for being on the show with us today.
Thanks so much
Welcome.
for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself,
Sure.
how you identify, how long you've been in Olympia, and maybe a little bit about what led you into activism and social service work.
Okay, let's see. So I identify as two-spirit, so I use she or he pronouns.
Okay.
I've been in Olympia since 1994. I came here to attend Evergreen and loved it. And well, I did move away for a year after I graduated, but I came back because it was, I really love the community here. In terms of activism, I am a survivor of multiple forms of violence, and so right about the spring before I came to Evergreen, I started volunteering with Seattle Rape Relief and got involved in the anti-violence movement, and I've, for the most part, been involved in that ever since.
And that was kind of part of the founding idea behind Partners in Prevention Education, right? That was,
absolutely.
Yeah.
So Partners in Prevention Education serves homeless and at-risk youth and young adults. But the thing that I found most exciting about the program was that, in addition to providing victim support services, therapy, advocacy, support groups, we also had an equally important focus on violence prevention, education, facilitating conversations with people in the community, particularly with youth, but with adults too, about what are the root causes of violence, and if we could change the world, what attitudes, values, beliefs, and norms would we promote that wouldn't allow violence to happen? And I found that work to be incredibly rewarding and engaging, and people in the community that participated in discussions like that became really engaged because they realized that they have the answers to that. And it's not something that we typically, in our society, it's not something that we typically have conversations about. I mean, unless you're a politician and,
Right,
maybe you spend
right.
A little while focused on it, but we were really looking at what are those underlying things that we can change in small ways that end up having ripple effects and can really change our society.
So when exactly did you found P.I.P.E, and what was that experience like? What kind of went into building that organization?
Well, let's see. I had my son in 2001, and so I moved out of the field for a little while and ran an in-home daycare. And then after a few years, a former employer called me and asked me if I would be willing to do a demonstration project working with marginalized youth around sexual violence prevention. And I was eager to get out of the house at that point because I absolutely loved being with the kids, but I also was really looking for some adult time outside of the home.
Sure.
I had spent about 4 years at home constantly.
Yeah.
And so when I had the opportunity, it was in 2004 that I started working with street youth around violence prevention. And through those discussions, the youth really said, you know what, we need our own organization that we can turn to when violence happens. We talked to them, we asked them about utilizing the likelihood that they would utilize some of the existing organizations in town, and some of which they didn't have relationship with, or the the ones that they did have relationship really didn't have a focus on violence prevention and youth empowerment. And so so we decided to go ahead and form a 501c3, and I co-founded it with a local therapist, Chandra Linderman. So she kind of handled the therapy program development in its initial years, and then I really focused on the admin and the prevention work, because that was really where my strength was, and my passion, doing the violence prevention work. So for the first few years, we were umbrellaed under Bread and Roses, and I believe it was in 2007 that Partners in Prevention became its own 501c3, and it continues to this day, I'm happy to say, even though I left the organization a few years ago to pursue some other endeavors. But I'm glad to see that they're still going strong.
Yep. I'm currently on the board of P.I.P.E.
Nice.
And we've hired some new staff, and we're continuing to, hold drop-in hours, and we now have trans and women's hours on Fridays, early Friday afternoons. But based on what you know about what P.I.P.E. is doing now, tell us a little bit about, how it sort of evolved to become from what you started to what it is today.
How did it evolve? One day at a time.
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer that question.
Well, so when P.I.P.E. started, was Community Youth Services and other organizations like that, were they available in the community at that time?
Absolutely. I mean, Community Youth Services has been around for over 40 years in this community. Some interesting stories there that I won't get into here. But yes, they were around. Safe Place, Bread and Roses, lots of the organizations that are around today were around then. It's just that I think that in some ways and I don't mean just locally, but I mean in general, I think nonprofits have become their own industry.
Oh, yes.
And unfortunately, that, in my perception of it, is that sometimes that means that the organization thinks that it knows better than the people that it's serving.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that was always important for us at P.I.P.E. was to center everything we do on the needs and the values of the people that we served. And so asking them, if we started to offer these services, is that something that you would access, or people that you know would access? How should we go about providing these services in a way that would be accessible, particularly for street youth? One of the things that we did that I don't think other organizations at the time were doing, and I think very few are still today, is providing therapy a bit on the fly. And by that I mean it wasn't necessarily in a set office space. Our therapists were willing to meet youth out on the street or at a coffee shop. We had to make some adjustments to be able to maintain confidentiality, so that folks weren't, their stories weren't being shared publicly in the middle of a coffee shop. But we learned to navigate those things and to put them into policy and procedures so that it became very clear about how these services can be offered in a non-traditional way.
Yeah. Well, I remember, doing some street outreach, back a few years ago, and it seems to me that part of what set P.I.P.E. apart from some of the other organizations that did similar kinds of work was partly that, that outreach, and also just the emphasis on violence prevention and that sort of expanded definition of violence to include things like poverty and discrimination. can you like tell us a little more about what sort of led up to that philosophy?
Well, I think that when we hear things like homeless and youth,
Right.
those words can be imbued with a lot of assumptions and meanings for people. And so by really listening to the youth that we were serving, by listening to their experience, and coupling that with also the literature around violence, around youth homelessness, around the things that lead to youth homelessness as well as adult homelessness,
Right.
the experiences that people have when they are houseless, homeless, street involved, or street dependent, came to realize that because of the assumptions and all of the baggage that's kind of put into those words that we use, that people, that I'm not saying everybody, but that there are some people who feel that it's justified to blame somebody for their homelessness or their poverty, when actually there's the root causes. I don't believe that anybody chooses to be homeless per se, or at least not most people. And when they do choose to be homeless, I think what people don't really realize is that they're choosing that because they believe that the street is somehow safer than their home or living environment.
Right.
And that
Yeah.
says a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to be able to recognize that things like poverty, addiction, child abuse, domestic violence, all of these things are intertwined and can be used as excuses to dismiss people,
Right.
or they can be used as avenues for trying to understand how individuals can end up in those situations. And at the end of the day, we cannot dismiss people's humanity. And I think that unfortunately that often happens when we're talking about homeless youth in particular, but the homeless community in general. And so that dismissal also marginalizes those folks. It makes them more invisible. It makes them more susceptible to being targets by people who are housed, people who have more access to resources, people who are within institutions who have more access to power, and they use those to further victimize folks who have already been marginalized. And because folks who are marginalized don't have a voice,
Right.
their stories aren't the ones that we're being told. Their narrative isn't the one that we're listening to. And unfortunately, it becomes the cycle of assumption, violence, dismissal, targeting, and it just keeps
Right.
cycling on itself.
Well, I imagine the causes that the kinds of systemic violence that lead to a person, being homeless or houseless, that can be especially true for GLBTQ youth. That homophobia in the home is often one of the things that force a young person onto the streets. P.I.P.E has kind of made a point of trying to center those marginalized voices and serve in particular people who are members of that community. Can you say a little more about what led you to want to focus particularly on GLBTQ youth, or
Well,
to make a point of serving that community in particular?
Well, they disproportionately represent the homeless community. So if we went by, and I don't know if the statistics have been updated, but if we went by what I would maybe call old school statistics, that maybe 10% of our society identifies as being LGBT, LGBT youth make up 30 to 40% of the homeless community.
Yeah.
And so there's a huge disproportionality.
Yeah.
And so if, again, P.I.P.E, it has always been centered on looking at root causes and contributing factors. And when there is something saying, hey, wait a minute, you know, there are a segment of people who are disproportionately represented within this other marginalized community, the first being LGBT, the second being homeless, the third really being youth, that, excuse me, it becomes important to look at what are those shared experiences that these folks have, and what are the underlying causes that led them to homelessness. So again, what are the attitudes, values, beliefs, and norms that allowed a youth to end up out on the street? And so it may be that, you know, parents they aren't accepting. Perhaps they just don't know how to deal with coming to terms with their child's identity. You know, maybe there are other factors, you know, like poverty or domestic violence or addiction that may also be in the home and contributing to the overall picture for a particular individual and leading them to, again, make that decision that somehow being out on the street is safer. And so it's also, I think for me, a personal thing. You know, I was always the kid that got picked on in school for one reason or another, you know, and it made me become more sensitive to why are people doing this? You know, why do people target other people for being different, for having a different color skin, for being a different gender, for having a different identity, for a different status than they do? And you know, I think where I've come to it over the years is to realize that that some people have power and control issues, and I have my own personal little theory that it's because we're afraid of death, and that that trying to have power and control in life is a way to try to diminish that fear of death or whatever else we might be afraid of. Being targets ourselves is maybe something else to be afraid of. And so I think, unfortunately, people have had positive reinforcement over the decades that, and over the centuries really, that being, that having that might is right kind of point of view is a way of shutting other people down and feeling more powerful. And so the violence prevention work that I've really spent my life doing has really been about trying to unpack that, you know, like, why is this? Because I don't believe that it's innate for people to be violent. I believe that, yes, we have the fight, flight, or freeze, but I don't think that left without that crisis situation, that there's any necessity for us to be violent, especially towards one another. You know, so really it's been about unpacking and trying to discredit this whole idea that somehow violence is natural in people. I just don't buy it.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that, you know, while the instinct to self-defend might be, you know, might be a natural instinct, the instinct to bully, I think maybe is what it comes down to. And of course, you know, anybody who works with youth, you know, has to look at the root causes of bullying.
I hope they do.
Yeah. P.I.P.E gets most of its funding from.
Well, historically, it's gotten most of its funding from the state, the Office of
Okay.
Crime Victims Advocacy, and some community support.
Right.
Although
right.
that can be very challenging, I think, because the assumptions that people have about homeless youth, but also about what I was alluding to earlier with the nonprofit industrial complex.
Yes. Yes.
And
I've heard that term before.
one of
Yeah.
one of the things that I was kind of chuckling about earlier, but not really addressing head on, is this idea that because there is one this was my experience in this town when I started P.I.P.E. It was to start talking to folks in the community about
Yeah.
this idea of starting this new nonprofit and focusing on violence prevention and victim services for an underserved segment of our community.
Right.
And there was at least one nonprofit, very well-known nonprofit in our community, who basically said, this town ain't big enough for two serving this particular population, and went so far as to engage in some shady behavior to try to diminish community support for P.I.P.E.
Yeah.
But that didn't stop us.
Yeah. Do you think that's because they saw
I
your
think,
two organizations as being in competition for limited resources?
yes, although if they have an over $1 million budget and we were struggling to build up a $100,000 budget maybe at the time, I don't quite see where there's real competition.
Yeah, well, particularly considering that there is such a large community in need of those services. You know, you would think it would take as many such organizations. I mean, right now it seems to me that we have a fair number of organizations in Olympia whose focus is services to the homeless community, both youth and adults. And yet there are still so many homeless and unhoused people still in need of those services. So, yeah, it seems like one of those kind of false choices.
Yeah, and also one of the things that I really prided myself on at P.I.P.E. was, and credit our entire staff for it, was this idea of, at the end of the day, our goal was to put ourselves out of work.
Yeah.
To not
Sure.
be necessary anymore, which I don't think is necessarily the goal of many nonprofits that function.
Well, yeah. There is something about the inherent structure of a nonprofit that's, you know, kind of drives it toward, you know, being self-perpetuating.
Which I can understand as long as there's a need for the services. Absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, build up your ability to provide those services, but what are we doing the work for?
Yeah.
You know, and if we're doing the work to, well, I don't know that
To maintain the organization rather than to serve the population that the organization is meant to serve.
Right.
Yeah. Then we're sort of chasing our own tail, I guess. Yeah. Well, so you stepped down as executive director of P.I.P.E. What was it now? 2 years ago?
I think it was about 2.5.
2.5 years
Yes.
ago. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I tell you a little bit about that?
Oh, please
It was a tough
yes.
time.
Yeah.
And I hope I'm not going to cry. So there was a very horrible murder that happened within the homeless community. There was a young queer identified youth who was not homeless, but who was a part of the street-involved community.
Right.
And he was murdered out in the woods by a couple of guys who were homeless at the time, and they burned his body, and that sent horrible fear through the community, through the homeless community in particular. And as a result, people who were living out in the woods came into town and started sleeping in doorways like like on the halls, on City Hall property.
Right, yeah.
And so the city at the time decided to pass an ordinance to make it illegal to sleep on city property.
Yeah.
And so, so folks who were already afraid for their lives out in the woods came into the city
Seeking safety.
And the city's response was, you're not safe here, we're gonna arrest you, give you more fines, you'll have warrants, things like that. And so folks started coming to some folks started coming to sleep on the porch at P.I.P.E, which we really worked with our community to try to negotiate how that could look, but there were a lot of challenges.
So this murder took place after P.I.P.E moved
into
to
the
property
purple house that it's at now, yes. And
I'm just wondering, was it ever established if this was a hate crime?
I don't believe that that was ever formally established.
Okay.
And so anyway, long story short is that it was already an uphill battle to advocate for youth, for homeless, for LGBT and other identified marginalized folks, and then to have this huge event that happened that was horrible, and then to have the city officials really ignore that and compound the problem. And we saw the effects that it had on folks, where it just became too much for me after a few years after that event happened, and so I needed to step away and find my joy again. And so that's what I did, and I opened up a food truck for a little while, as you know, and then Trump got elected, and I freaked out and decided I better go get a job.
Well, you and a lot of other people, I think.
It took me nearly a year, but I think it was very serendipitous that I ended up at Pizza Klatch, which I had been involved with through my role at P.I.P.E. But this is, so I'm now the executive director at Pizza Klatch, and I just think that it's a wonderful fit. I love the organization. There are dozens of amazing volunteers who are very, very involved in the organization to a level that I've never seen before. And so I consider myself to be very lucky to be with Pizza Klatch now.
Well, we're very happy to have you aboard. I must admit, I was very, very happy when I heard you got the position. So far, I know you've only been, on the job for a little while now.
2.5 months.
Yes. So far, are you finding it very different from working at P.I.P.E?
The way that I find it to be very different is that there is a ton of community support. It's like, it used to be like, listen to me, and let me tell you about the folks that we serve and the services that we provide. And these days, I tell people I work for Pizza Klatch, and they're like, oh, I love Pizza Klatch. So that's very different, and it feels wonderful and a little overwhelming at times, because there are so many folks that, I'm currently the only staff member. We're working on hiring some staff right now, but as the only person
we
currently
will get
there,
you some help.
I'm just overwhelmed by the amount of people who contact us and say, I want to volunteer, I want to donate, I want to come work for you, and I'm like, whoa.
And that's different from the way it was at P.I.P.E.
Absolutely. I mean, there were
Yeah.
wonderful folks that wanted to be involved with P.I.P.E. And as a new organization, I mean, I was the founding executive director there for 11 years, so it was building it from the ground up.
Yeah.
Pizza Klatch, on the other hand, has been around for 10 years, and so they have a lot of the structure in place, and so I'm just coming in and kind of working the system,
Right.
and not having to necessarily build it from the ground up.
Do you think that kind of the attitudes of the community towards Pizza Klatch differ from the attitudes toward P.I.P.E. because of maybe prejudices or preconceived notions about the different populations?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I know that there are that there have been and that there probably continues to be youth who have accessed services through Partners in Prevention as well as participated in Pizza Klatch. I know that there's overlap there. And so, yes, I think the difference in community support has to do with folks' assumptions about what it means to be homeless and those perceptions that they get in the way.
Yeah. Well, having been a facilitator with Pizza Klatch for 4 or 5 years now, I of course, our goal is always to try to, prevent youth from becoming homeless in the first place, but it does happen. I mean, I still run into a couple of my, Pizza Klatch alums, who are still struggling to find stable housing, even though they've been graduated from high school for, a couple of years now. So it's, I mean, there certainly is overlap in the community, and I mean, just the fact that some 40% of homeless youth identify as GLBTQ, I mean, and especially in a small, relatively small city, area like Thurston County, you're certainly gonna see a lot of the same kids in both contexts. So has it been, I imagine you've been on a pretty steep learning curve since taking the position with Pizza Klatch. Is it showing any signs of leveling out yet? Or?
Yes, it is. I thank goodness for my organizational skills, because I have a folder for every one of our 40 volunteers, so that I can track all of the different conversations that are constantly going. But it is really exciting that we have also just recently been awarded a grant from the Office of Crime Victims Advocacy that's going to allow us to hire a couple of staff members.
Oh, good, yeah.
So most immediately we're going to be hiring a program manager to help work with all of our 40 or 30 or so facilitators, and we're currently in 12 of the 14 high schools in Thurston County, so that's terribly exciting. So they will help to manage all of the relationships with the various schools, as well as our volunteer facilitators. And then we are waiting to hear back about another grant that will allow us to hire a replication manager or an expansion manager, so somebody who can help us to outreach to the local middle schools. We've heard a lot of requests to get us into the middle schools and be that supportive presence for younger youth during the very difficult time of junior high. And then we're also going to be hiring four part-time staff facilitators who can also work with youth after Pizza Klatch to provide some emotional support or help them get connected with other resources in the community. Good. And be right there in the schools with them.
So that's a pretty ambitious vision, it sounds like, for Pizza Klatch Pizza Klatch's future.
Absolutely.
You know, going into middle schools, expanding into more high schools, expanding beyond the Thurston County area.
None of this was my idea. I just inherited
No,
all
this,
of these
oh no,
things.
this is things we've been talking about for a
Yes.
while. I mean, for our audience members who don't know, Pizza Klatch was founded in 2007, and it started out in just one high school, North Thurston, and you know, from there, you know, I guess about maybe 3 years ago, we hit a bit of a growth spurt when, you know, high schools started coming to us and asking us to establish groups, you know, in their schools, because they had heard about us, and you know, we developed a reputation, and you know.
Yes, and from what I hear, they heard about you, heard about Pizza Klatch primarily from the principal at North Thurston, who was singing the praises of the difference that the presence that the Pizza Klatch groups made in the schools for the students who were participating, as well as for the school environment, because youth, simply by finding the support so let me back up. So Pizza Klatch, for those who don't know, is a peer support group that happens during lunchtime, pizza served, and LGBT and allied youth are invited to come and just share what's going on in their lives. You know, what are the highs, what are the lows, what are the challenges, what are the successes, and that simple act of making that space available, that intentional space, I think has empowered hundreds of our local youth to start speaking up when they hear derogatory terms in the classroom or in the hallways. They are speaking up when they're hearing incidents of bullying. In some cases, they may be making reports to the schools or to their parents or to, you know, adults or other friends. And so by finding that simple peer support, they are feeling the sense of empowerment to go beyond maybe what maybe my generation did. And I think that ripple effect is huge. And you know, we're currently we have 20 Pizza Klatch groups that are happening in the 12 high schools that we're currently in, and on a weekly basis we're seeing nearly 300 youth between those groups. That is amazing.
Yes. Yeah, and it's been remarkable to me how many youth show up that do not necessarily identify as GLBTQ, but you know, are having, you know, they may be on the autism spectrum, or they may just be, you know, experiencing some social awkwardness, or, you know, they might have, you know, any other, you know, host of reasons to need a safe, confidential, non-judgmental, supportive space, you know. And, you know, in the 5 years that I've been doing this, I have to say the most amazing thing is to see the way the youth create support networks among themselves. In fact, just this past Thursday, I substituted at Olympia High School, and because of a little scheduling snafu, they had an assembly that we weren't told about, so the lunch period was actually pushed back an hour, and we tried to like call the pizza place and adjust, but it just so happened that both the other facilitator and I were a little bit late getting, you know, to the room, and when we got there, everybody had set up in a circle and they'd started check-ins without us.
Awesome.
And I was like, that's how we know we're a success.
Yeah.
You know, that they can just kind of take that ball and run with it, and you know, I mean, you know.
I had the privilege of sitting in. Well, I've substituted and sat in on some of the Pizza Klatches since I started, and it's so fun to sit, you know, to kind of sit back and watch, because the time that I was doing more of that than I am at this, like this week,
Right.
was as school was just starting and groups were needing to reestablish group agreements.
Right.
And so it warmed my heart to sit back and watch as certain youth would step up, and they presented themselves in such a way that I thought, that person is destined to be a facilitator. Maybe not for Pizza Klatch, maybe at their college or in some other venue, but they are taking the things that we role model and they're making it a part of themselves and growing from there.
Yeah.
And it's just amazing to see. When I was in high school, people, we knew who some of the queer kids were.
Yeah.
And, for the most part, at least in my school, there were our peers were accepting, but there was this kind of like, ha ha ha, you don't really talk about it, you make fun of it, and, but it's all in good fun, right? And we've come so far since then, and I'm just a little jealous of.
Well, that's the other thing I hear over and over again from adults is, I wish there had been something like this in my high school.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, how much further would we be in life if we had that as one of our, touchstones back then? Yeah. So,
well, of course, I graduated from high school in the days before GSAs, and before,
me too.
Yeah. But I was lucky in a way. I went to a high school that was part of a community in which education was the dominant industry, and so there was a lot of I lived in a town where there was a pretty vocal queer community. My parents were college professors. And I got approached when I came out very publicly in my high school, and I was approached by one of my guidance counselors who said, hey, I want you to help me start, a support group for students who are, having, issues outside of school. And that's how I got involved in this racket.
In my day, we called that drama class.
Yes, well. Yeah. But so anyway, we certainly look forward to seeing Pizza Klatch, fly high and far under your leadership.
Well,
no pressure.
Yeah, none taken. It's Pizza Klatch. The backbone of Pizza Klatch is really all of the amazing volunteers, the facilitators, the board of directors, folks that have already offered to come in and help out around the office with any little thing. Yeah. It's terribly exciting to be a part of it because of everybody else's excitement and their willingness to just jump in and do. And so I feel like a bit of a conductor who just kind of needs to listen to the music and go, okay, that sounds great. Okay, yes, let me write that down and communicate it to others. And so it doesn't feel like a very big challenge. It's a joy, really.
Well, and the other thing I wanted to mention is that we do have opportunities for youth to become part of the leadership of Pizza Klatch. We have
we are always looking
board positions open for youth representatives.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Our board of directors right now is doing some board assessment to kind of see, like what kind of talents and community connections do we already have on the board. Yeah. But we absolutely need more youth on the board. Right now we only have one. Yes. And I would like to change that very quickly. Yep. And I know all of the board members would too. So so if you're a young person who would like to get involved with Pizza Klatch and would like to be one of my bosses, please come join us. The information is available on our website, pizzaklatch.org.
Which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, www.pizzaKlatch.org. www.pizzaklatch.org.
And
we have an upcoming fundraising gala.
Yes, on February 3rd.
Yep, at the Washington Center for the Performing Arts. And we hope everyone will come. And, we usually have participation by our youth there too. Is there any parting message?
Be the change that you want to be in this world. Yeah.
All right. Rosalinda Noriega, Executive Director of Pizza Klatch, thank you very much for being with us. And thank you for joining us on Tea Time in Olympia. And have a good evening.
Thank you.